Dorothy Whitman's weathered hand froze halfway to her purse, her faded blue eyes locked on the three small figures standing beside the livestock pen. The burlap sacks tied over their heads like executioners' hoods should have been shocking enough. It wasn't the sacks that made her breath catch in her throat like a fishhook. The smallest boy, no taller than a fence post, had turned his covered head directly toward her through the crowd of Saturday buyers. "Mrs. Dorothy," came a muffled voice, clear as church bells across the dusty Texas market square. The auctioneer's gavel clattered to the wooden platform. Two women behind Dorothy gasped and stepped backward, their shopping baskets forgotten. Even the cattle had gone silent. Dorothy's chest tightened with the same recognition she'd felt holding Harold's final letter from the Pacific 7 years ago, when the impossible became terrifyingly real. How could this child know her name? How could any of them know her name when she'd never seen them before in her 65 years of living in Millfield? "Orphans, $3 each," the red-faced auctioneer stammered, his voice uncertain now. "No names, no ages, no questions." What had brought these children to her doorstep disguised as coincidence? And why did her heart already know the answer her mind refused to accept? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 6 months earlier, Dorothy Whitman had awakened to another empty house and the familiar ache of silence pressing against her ribs like a broken promise. The morning light filtered through Harold's favorite chair, where dust motes danced in the space his body once filled. 7 years had passed since the telegram arrived with its cold, official words about her husband's sacrifice in the Pacific, yet she still set 2 coffee cups on the kitchen counter each dawn before remembering. At 65, Dorothy carried herself with the determined posture of a woman who had learned to shoulder grief without letting it break her spine. Her silver hair, once golden as wheat, was pulled back in the same practical bun she'd worn since Harold shipped out in 1943. The $47 that arrived each month from the government pension office barely covered necessities, but it kept the roof over her head and beans on her table. The farmhouse, weathered gray as her hair, sat on 40 acres of cotton fields that had surrendered to drought 3 seasons running. Millfield, Texas, population 847 according to the faded sign at the town limits, had withered alongside its crops. The war had taken its young men and never given them back. What remained was a community of widows, old-timers, and the occasional drifter passing through on Highway 6. Main Street consisted of Hartley's General Store, the First Baptist Church where Reverend Blackwell preached to half-empty pews, and Murphy's Diner, where coffee cost a nickel, and conversation came free with a side of gossip. Dorothy's closest neighbors were the Andersons, a mile down the dusty road, and old Sheriff Morgan, whose arthritis had slowed his patrol car to a crawl, but sharpened his ability to read the character of strangers. The town's children attended the one-room schoolhouse where Miss Patterson taught grades 1 through 8 with the patience of Job and the firmness of Moses. The livestock auction held every second Saturday brought farmers from 3 counties to Millfield's dusty market square. Dorothy rarely attended, having no livestock to sell and little money to spend, but the event drew peddlers, traveling preachers, and occasionally the kind of business that preferred to operate in the shadows between legitimate commerce and something altogether darker. Harold's photograph smiled at her from the mantelpiece each evening, frozen in his army uniform with the same blue eyes that had once promised her a house full of children's laughter. Those children never came. 3 miscarriages had taught Dorothy that some dreams die harder than others, and some empty rooms echo longer than a heart can bear. She had learned to find purpose in small things, tending her victory garden, mending clothes for neighbors who paid in eggs or vegetables, and writing letters to other war widows who understood the particular loneliness of loving a ghost. But purpose was not the same as joy, and joy had been absent from Dorothy's life longer than she cared to count. On this particular October morning, something had stirred her from routine, compelling her toward town with an urgency she couldn't name but dared not ignore. The $18 Dorothy pressed into the auctioneer's sweaty palm represented 2 weeks of careful budgeting and the sacrifice of her Sunday church dress, sold to Mrs. Anderson just that morning. As the burlap sacks fell away from 3 small faces, the crowd's murmur died to an uncomfortable silence that stretched like piano wire about to snap. The oldest boy possessed eyes the color of winter sky, pale and guarded, set in a face too thin for his 12 years. His jaw carried the set of someone who had learned early that the world offered more blows than kindness. When he looked at Dorothy, she saw wariness wrapped around a fierce protectiveness for the 2 smaller figures flanking him. The middle child, perhaps 9, had the delicate features of a china doll and the stillness of prey that knows it's being watched. His dark hair fell across eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of his surroundings, as if mapping escape routes had become second nature. A faded bruise yellowed along his jawline, and his clothes hung loose on a frame that spoke of too many missed meals. But it was the smallest boy who held Dorothy's attention like a magnet draws iron. 6 years old at most, with Harold's unmistakable blue eyes and the kind of golden hair that catches sunlight even in shadow. When their gazes met, something shifted in Dorothy's chest, a recognition so profound it nearly buckled her knees. "What are your names?" she asked, her voice gentler than the autumn breeze stirring the dust around their feet. The oldest boy stepped slightly forward, shoulders squared despite his size. "I'm Sam Peterson. This here's Tommy Hayes, and the little one's Billy Joe Miller." His voice carried traces of education that suggested a fall from better circumstances. Dorothy nodded, studying each face as if committing them to memory. "I'm Dorothy Whitman, but most folks call me Mrs. Dorothy." "You boys hungry?" Billy Joe's stomach answered with a growl that made him blush crimson. Tommy's eyes darted to Sam, seeking permission to hope, while Sam himself remained stone-faced. "When's the last time you ate?" Dorothy asked. "Yesterday morning," Sam admitted reluctantly. "They don't feed you before auction day. Says it makes you look too satisfied." The casual cruelty of the statement hit Dorothy like a physical blow. She had seen cattle treated with more consideration than these children received. "Well then, we'd better get you home and remedy that situation." The ride to Dorothy's farm passed in loaded silence. Sam sat stiffly beside her on the wagon seat, while Tommy and Billy Joe huddled together in the back among empty feed sacks and farm tools. The boy's eyes never stopped moving, cataloging landmarks and distances with the instinct of creatures who had learned that survival meant always knowing where the exits were. Dorothy's farmhouse appeared modest and weathered as they crested the small hill leading to her property. The white paint had faded to gray, and the front porch sagged slightly on the left side, but the windows gleamed clean and flower boxes still held the stubborn remnants of her summer marigolds. "This is home," Dorothy announced, then caught herself. "This is my home. We'll see about the rest." Inside, the house smelled of lavender soap and the lingering ghost of Harold's pipe tobacco. The boys stood clustered near the door like deer ready to bolt, taking in the simple furnishings, the braided rugs Dorothy had made during lonely evenings, and the photographs that marked a life shared and lost. "Sit," Dorothy commanded gently, gesturing toward the kitchen table. "I'll get something started." As she moved around the small kitchen, pulling down her largest pot and reaching for the bag of beans she'd been rationing, Dorothy found herself stealing glances at her unexpected guests. Sam's posture never relaxed, his attention divided between watching Dorothy and monitoring the younger boys. Tommy had pulled a stub of pencil from his pocket and was sketching something on a scrap of paper with intense concentration. Billy Joe simply stared at Dorothy with those impossibly familiar blue eyes. "How did you know my name?" Dorothy asked suddenly, the question that had been burning in her chest since the market square. Billy Joe looked up from where he'd been tracing patterns on the table with his finger. "I dreamed about you," he said simply. "A lady with sad eyes and gentle hands who would take care of us. You sang to me in the dream." Dorothy's wooden spoon clattered against the pot's edge. "What did I sing?" "Danny boy," Billy Joe whispered. "The same song the soldier used to sing before he went away." The room spun slightly around Dorothy's edges. Harold's favorite song, the one he hummed while shaving each morning, the melody that had followed him to war and never returned home. How could this child possibly know that? "What soldier?" she managed to ask. But Billy Joe had already turned his attention back to the table patterns, leaving Dorothy with questions that multiplied like shadows at sunset. The first crack in Sam Peterson's armor appeared 3 days after their arrival, when Dorothy found him standing in Harold's old workshop, running his fingers along the dusty workbench with the reverence of someone recognizing sanctuary. A folded newspaper clipping had fallen from his pocket, yellowed with age and soft from countless handling. Dorothy picked up the paper, her reading glasses catching the morning light streaming through the workshop window. "Peterson Bank closes doors forever," read the headline from the Dallas Morning News, dated March 15, 1951. Below it, a smaller article detailed the suicide of bank president William Peterson, found in his Cadillac with a pistol, and a note apologizing for the gambling debts that had bankrupted the institution and ruined dozens of families. "That was my father," Sam said quietly, not turning around. "Used to take me to the bank every Saturday morning, let me sit in his big leather chair and pretend I was important. Told everyone I'd run the place someday, carry on the Peterson name with pride." Dorothy folded the clipping carefully and handed it back to him. "What happened after?" "Mother remarried quick as she could. Her new husband didn't appreciate having another man's son around, especially one who looked just like the fool who'd lost everything." Sam's voice carried no self-pity, only the flat acceptance of someone who had learned that life's promises were written in disappearing ink. Said I reminded him too much of failure. 2 months later, I was on a train to my aunt's house in Arkansas. Month after that, she decided she couldn't afford to feed me either. The workshop fell silent except for the whisper of dust motes dancing in the sunbeams. Dorothy watched Sam's hands continue their exploration of Harold's tools, noting how naturally he tested the balance of a hammer, the sharpness of a chisel. These were hands that remembered what it meant to build things instead of just surviving them. Meanwhile, Tommy Hayes revealed his own secrets through art rather than words. Dorothy discovered his talent when she found detailed drawings tucked under his pillow, portraits of people he claimed to have never met, landscapes of places he'd never been, and most disturbing of all, scenes of children huddled in dark spaces that spoke of experiences no 9-year-old should carry. "You're very talented," Dorothy said one evening, finding Tommy sketching by lamplight at the kitchen table. The drawing showed a woman with kind eyes standing in a doorway, arms outstretched toward 3 small figures walking toward her out of darkness. Tommy's pencil paused. "My mama used to say I got the gift from her daddy. He painted pictures for the church before the fever took him." It was the longest sentence Dorothy had heard him speak since arriving. "What happened to your parents?" "Car went off the bridge during the spring floods. Daddy was drinking again, and Mama was trying to get us away from him." Tommy's pencil resumed its movement, adding shadows to the woman's outstretched arms. "I was supposed to be in that car, but I was hiding in the barn because they'd been fighting all day. When they found me 3 days later, they said it was a miracle I was alive." "Maybe it was," Dorothy said softly. "Don't feel like a miracle," Tommy whispered. "Feels like being punished for not dying with them." But it was Billy Joe who provided the most unsettling mysteries. Dorothy caught him humming melodies that made her heart ache with recognition. Not just "Danny Boy," but "I'll Be Seeing You," and White Christmas, songs that Harold had sung while cooking breakfast on Sunday mornings or working in the garden during their brief happy years together. More disturbing were the details Billy Joe knew about things he shouldn't understand. And he knew that Harold kept peppermint candies in his left coat pocket, that he read the newspaper from back to front, and that he always kissed the top of Dorothy's head before leaving for work each morning. "How do you know these things?" Dorothy asked one evening after Billy Joe had accurately described Harold's habit of talking to the photographs on the mantelpiece. "The soldier told me," Billy Joe said matter-of-factly. "In my dreams. He said he was sorry he couldn't come home, but he wanted to make sure someone would take care of his Dorothy." The explanation sent chills racing down Dorothy's spine. She wanted to dismiss it as a child's fantasy, but the specificity of Billy Joe's knowledge defied rational explanation. There were details about Harold that even their closest friends didn't know, intimacies shared only between husband and wife. Dorothy's financial situation grew more precarious with each passing day. 3 growing boys consumed food at an alarming rate, and her meager pension stretched thinner than morning shadows. She found herself making impossible choices: medicine for her arthritis or milk for Billy Joe's persistent cough, heating oil for the house or shoes to replace Tommy's worn-out boots that let in the cold November rain. The decision to sell Harold's gold watch came after she discovered Sam sharing his dinner portions with his younger companions, pretending he wasn't hungry while his ribs showed more prominently each day. The watch had been Harold's father's, carried through the trenches of France in 1918 and passed down with stories of courage and sacrifice. Dorothy sold it to the pawn dealer in the next county for $43. Enough to buy winter coats and groceries for 3 weeks. But the town's reaction to Dorothy's new family proved more challenging than financial hardship. Reverend Blackwell expressed concerns during his pastoral visit, questioning whether an unmarried woman of Dorothy's age could properly manage 3 boys who had come from questionable circumstances. Sheriff Morgan stopped by twice in 1 week, ostensibly checking on Dorothy's welfare, but actually assessing whether the boys posed any threat to community peace. The real test came when Dorothy took the boys to church for the first time. The congregation's whispers followed them down the aisle like shadows, and several families deliberately moved their children away from the pew where Dorothy settled with Sam, Tommy, and Billy Joe. Mrs. Henderson, the postmaster's wife, made pointed comments about charity cases and knowing one's limitations just loud enough for Dorothy to hear. After the service, Town Councilman Roberts approached Dorothy with barely concealed hostility. "Now, Dorothy, we all appreciate your Christian charity, but these boys have been nothing but trouble everywhere they've been placed. Sheriff's gotten reports from 3 counties about their behavior. Maybe it's time to let the proper authorities handle this situation." "What kind of reports?" Dorothy asked, her voice steady despite the fury building in her chest. "Fighting, stealing, destruction of property. The Peterson boy broke another child's nose with a horseshoe just 2 months ago. That's not the kind of influence we want around our children." Dorothy looked at Sam, who stood rigid beside her, fists clenched, but saying nothing. She saw the shame in his eyes, the expectation of abandonment that had become his default response to adult disappointment. "Mr. Roberts," Dorothy said quietly, "these boys are my family now. And if you have concerns about their behavior, I suggest you address them directly with me, rather than spreading gossip in God's house." The confrontation marked a turning point. Dorothy realized that keeping her boys would require more than maternal instinct and good intentions. It would demand fighting battles she was only beginning to understand against forces that viewed compassion as weakness and difference as danger. That night, as Dorothy tucked the boys into their makeshift beds in the living room, she made a silent promise to Harold's photograph watching from the mantelpiece. These children had found their way to her through circumstances too strange for coincidence. Whatever storms lay ahead, she would not let them weather those storms alone. November arrived in Millfield like an unwelcome relative, bringing cold winds that rattled the farmhouse windows and reminded Dorothy that winter would test more than just her heating budget. The boys had settled into routines that resembled the rhythm of family life, though trust remained as fragile as the first ice forming on the water barrel each morning. Sam had appointed himself the man of the house with the seriousness of someone who understood that survival often depended on assuming responsibilities beyond one's years. He rose before dawn to feed the chickens Dorothy had managed to buy with her watch money, chopped kindling with Harold's old axe, and watched his younger companions with the vigilance of a shepherd who had learned that wolves came in many forms. When the ancient Ford pickup refused to start on cold mornings, Sam's mechanical instincts kicked in, his hands moving with surprising knowledge as he adjusted the carburetor and checked the spark plugs. "Where'd you learn about engines?" Dorothy asked one particularly frigid morning after Sam had coaxed the truck to life with the patience of a horse whisperer. "My father's chauffeur taught me," Sam replied, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. "Back when we had a chauffeur. Said every man should understand how machines work, because machines don't lie to you like people do." Tommy's artistic talents blossomed in the warm sanctuary of Dorothy's kitchen, where he created a gallery of drawings that transformed blank spaces into windows of wonder. He sketched Dorothy kneading bread, her flour-dusted hands caught in motion, her face wearing the concentration of someone who measured ingredients by heart rather than sight. He drew Sam building a chicken coop, muscles straining against boards that seemed determined to remain uncooperative. Most remarkably, he painted a watercolor of Billy Joe singing, somehow capturing the ethereal quality of a child's voice reaching toward heaven. But it was his portrait of the four of them seated around the dinner table that made Dorothy's breath catch in her throat. Tommy had painted their makeshift family with the kind of attention to detail that revealed deep observation and deeper affection. Harold's empty chair sat at the table's head, not lonely but expectant, as if the artist understood that some presences transcend physical absence. "This is beautiful, honey," Dorothy said, studying the painting by lamplight. "You've made us look like we belong together." "We do belong together," Tommy replied with the matter-of-fact certainty that children possess before the world teaches them to doubt their instincts. "That's why you found us." Billy Joe continued to mystify Dorothy with knowledge that defied explanation. He knew that Harold had kept a harmonica in his tool shed, though Dorothy had forgotten its existence until Billy Joe led her directly to the dusty corner where it lay buried under paint cans and seed packets. He hummed melodies that Harold had invented during quiet moments, wordless tunes that had never been written down or shared with anyone else. Most unsettling was Billy Joe's ability to predict Dorothy's moods and needs with uncanny accuracy. He appeared with aspirin when her arthritis flared before she mentioned the pain. He brought her reading glasses moments before she realized she'd misplaced them. And on the nights when loneliness pressed against her chest like a physical weight, Billy Joe would climb into her lap and hum until the aching eased. Thanksgiving preparations began with more hope than resources. Dorothy's pantry held flour, dried beans, and the stubborn optimism of a woman determined to create abundance from scarcity. She had saved enough money to buy a small turkey from Farmer Jenkins, though it meant postponing the purchase of winter boots for Tommy, whose feet had grown 2 sizes since October. The boys threw themselves into holiday preparations with the enthusiasm of children who had learned not to take celebrations for granted. Sam constructed a dining table from salvaged lumber and Harold's workbench, sanding the wood until it gleamed like satin. Tommy created place cards decorated with autumn leaves and painted pilgrim scenes that would have impressed the ladies' auxiliary at First Baptist. Billy Joe practiced singing hymns for their Thanksgiving dinner, his clear soprano voice floating through the house like incense, but their domestic tranquility faced constant threats from the outside world. Jeremiah Stone, the auctioneer who had sold the boys to Dorothy, began appearing at her farm with increasing frequency, always with flimsy excuses about checking on livestock or delivering messages that could have been handled through proper channels. His visits left Dorothy with the unsettling feeling of being observed and evaluated, though she couldn't determine the criteria for judgment. "Those boys settling in well?" Stone asked during one unexpected visit, his small eyes scanning the yard where Sam was teaching Tommy to swing an axe properly. "Some children take to domestic life better than others. Some are just too wild for taming." "They're not wild animals, Mr. Stone," Dorothy replied coolly. "They're children who needed a home." "Course they are," Stone agreed too quickly. "Just saying sometimes what looks like kindness can turn into trouble nobody saw coming. Boys that age got energy needs directing, if you catch my meaning." Dorothy didn't catch his meaning and didn't want to. She watched Stone's eyes linger on Billy Joe, who was hanging laundry with the careful attention to detail that characterized everything the child did. Something about the man's interest made her skin crawl, though she couldn't articulate why. Reverend Blackwell's pastoral visits became exercises in barely concealed interrogation. He questioned the boys about their spiritual education, their moral development, and their adjustment to proper Christian family life. His particular concern seemed focused on Sam's influence over the younger children, as if leadership qualities in a 12-year-old represented some form of moral contamination. "The Peterson boy carries himself with considerable pride," Reverend Blackwell observed during one visit, watching Sam help Tommy repair a broken fence post. "Pride goeth before destruction, as Scripture reminds us. Perhaps some correction might benefit his character development." "Sam's pride comes from taking responsibility for his family," Dorothy replied firmly. "I see nothing that needs correcting in a boy who protects those smaller than himself." "Family?" The Reverend's eyebrows rose toward his receding hairline. "Mrs. Whitman, these children are not your family in any legal sense. They're wards of the state temporarily placed in your care through irregular circumstances. Becoming too attached might prove emotionally hazardous." The warning stung more than Dorothy cared to admit. She had begun thinking of the boys as hers, planning futures that included school enrollment, birthday celebrations, and Christmas mornings filled with the chaos that only children can create. The Reverend's words reminded her that love and law didn't always align, and that her claim to these children rested on shakier ground than her heart wanted to acknowledge. Sheriff Morgan's visits followed a different pattern, focused more on investigation than pastoral care. He asked pointed questions about the boys' behavior, any signs of troublemaking, and whether Dorothy felt confident in her ability to maintain order. His inquiries suggested reports had been filed, complaints registered, though he remained vague about specific accusations. "Got a call from the county school superintendent," Sheriff Morgan mentioned during one visit, his weathered hands wrapped around a coffee cup Dorothy had reluctantly offered. "Seems there's been some discussion about enrollment procedures for your boys. Paperwork's complicated when children come from uncertain backgrounds." "What kind of complications?" Dorothy asked, though she suspected the answer would confirm her worst fears. "Birth certificates, vaccination records, previous school transcripts. Standard documentation that proves these children are who they claim to be and haven't been reported missing from other jurisdictions." Sheriff Morgan's tone remained professionally neutral, but his eyes carried the weight of someone delivering bad news. "State's gotten particular about record-keeping since the war ended. Too many displaced persons, too many children lost in the shuffle." The implications hit Dorothy like cold water. Without proper documentation, the boys couldn't attend school legally. Without school enrollment, their presence in her home became increasingly difficult to justify to authorities who viewed irregular situations with suspicion. She was caught in a bureaucratic maze that treated children like inventory rather than human beings. Christmas planning began in early December with careful budgeting and creative resourcefulness. Dorothy had managed to save $11 from her pension after covering December's necessities, enough for modest gifts if she shopped carefully and made several items by hand. She spent evenings knitting scarves from unraveled sweaters, mending toys salvaged from the church donation box, and planning a holiday feast that would stretch her resources to their absolute limit. The boys contributed their own efforts to Christmas preparations. Sam carved wooden toys with Harold's old whittling knife, creating a set of farm animals for Billy Joe and a pencil box for Tommy that featured intricate geometric patterns. Tommy painted Christmas cards that rivaled anything available in Hartley's general store, his artistic talent transforming cheap cardboard into miniature masterpieces. Billy Joe practiced Christmas carols with the dedication of someone preparing for Carnegie Hall, his voice maturing with each passing week. Their first Christmas Eve together arrived with a mixture of anticipation and anxiety that characterized most significant moments in their new life. Dorothy had managed to find a small pine tree growing wild behind the barn, which the boys decorated with paper ornaments, popcorn strings, and candles that transformed their modest living room into something approaching magical. As they gathered around the tree for their Christmas Eve devotions, Dorothy felt the profound satisfaction of creating something meaningful from circumstances that had initially seemed impossible. These three boys had arrived in her life carrying their own damaged histories and uncertain futures, but somehow they had woven themselves into the fabric of her existence with threads strong enough to support dreams she had thought permanently broken. But even in moments of greatest happiness, Dorothy remained aware of the fragile foundation supporting their family structure. Questions about the boys' legal status remained unresolved. Community acceptance continued to fluctuate based on gossip and prejudice, and her financial resources stretched thinner with each passing month. She had created a sanctuary for 3 wounded children, but sanctuaries required protection from forces that viewed compassion as weakness and difference as danger. The letter arrived on December 27th, delivered by a county official whose formal manner suggested its contents would not bring holiday joy. Dorothy's hands trembled as she read the state's notification that an investigation had been initiated regarding the welfare and legal status of 3 minor children currently residing in her care without proper authorization. The boys watched her face carefully as she folded the letter and placed it on the kitchen table with deliberate calm. They had learned to read adult expressions the way sailors read storm clouds, understanding that survival often depended on recognizing danger before it struck. "What does it say?" Sam asked quietly. Dorothy looked at the 3 faces that had become her reason for rising each morning and finding strength for each day's challenges. "It says, we're going to have to fight for our family," she replied, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her chest. "But that's nothing we haven't been doing since the day I brought you home." The courthouse in Millfield had witnessed its share of human drama over the decades, but few proceedings carried the emotional weight of the hearing scheduled for February 14, 1953. Valentine's Day would determine whether Dorothy Whitman possessed the legal right to continue caring for 3 boys who had become the center of her existence, or whether the state would sever bonds that had grown stronger than blood. Judge Harrison presided over the hearing with the weary authority of someone who had spent 30 years making decisions that rarely satisfied anyone completely. His weathered face showed the accumulated weight of Solomon's choices, understanding that legal precedent and human compassion didn't always align in perfect harmony. The courtroom filled with an odd mixture of supporters and opponents, creating an atmosphere thick with tension and unspoken loyalties. Dorothy sat at the defendant's table, wearing her best dress, a navy blue wool that had seen better decades but maintained its dignity through careful maintenance and stubborn pride. Beside her, the boys wore their Sunday clothes, hair combed and faces scrubbed, looking like defendants in a trial where their crime was being unwanted by anyone except the woman who had chosen them. The state's case, presented by Attorney General Morrison, followed predictable lines of argument. Dorothy lacked proper legal authority to care for the children. Her financial resources were insufficient to provide adequate support. Her age and unmarried status raised questions about her ability to manage 3 boys approaching adolescence. Most damaging, the boys themselves carried histories of behavioral problems that suggested they required professional intervention rather than amateur kindness. These children have been removed from 4 previous placements due to incidents of violence, theft, and willful destruction of property, Morrison declared, his voice carrying the conviction of someone who had convinced himself that institutional care represented mercy rather than abandonment. Mrs. Whitman's good intentions cannot overcome the reality that these boys require specialized handling that only trained professionals can provide. Morrison's presentation included testimony from previous foster parents who described Sam's explosive temper, Tommy's tendency toward withdrawal and depression, and Billy Joe's strange behavior that several witnesses characterized as unnatural and disturbing. The cumulative effect painted a picture of 3 deeply damaged children whose problems exceeded the capabilities of an elderly widow living in rural poverty. Reverend Blackwell's testimony proved particularly devastating. Speaking with the moral authority that his position afforded, he expressed concerns about Dorothy's spiritual fitness to guide 3 young souls toward Christian maturity. He questioned her ability to provide proper discipline, suggested that her attachment to the boys bordered on unhealthy obsession, and implied that her isolation from community standards had impaired her judgment regarding appropriate child-rearing practices. Mrs. Whitman has created an environment where these boys are protected from the consequences of their actions, Reverend Blackwell testified, his voice heavy with regret that barely concealed satisfaction. True Christian love requires correction and guidance, not indulgence that allows sinful behavior to flourish unchecked. The Reverend's words stung Dorothy more deeply than legal arguments about financial inadequacy or age-related concerns. Her faith had sustained her through Harold's death, through years of loneliness, and through the daily challenges of creating a family from broken pieces. To have her Christian commitment questioned by someone who preached love while practicing judgment felt like betrayal of the deepest kind. When Dorothy finally took the stand in her own defense, she spoke with the quiet dignity of someone who had learned that truth didn't require volume to carry weight. She described her daily life with the boys, the small victories and continuing challenges, the gradual transformation she had witnessed as 3 wounded children began to heal within the structure of consistent love and expectations. "Sam hasn't had a single fight since he's been with me," Dorothy testified, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Tommy speaks now, draws pictures of hope instead of hiding. Billy Joe laughs every day, something the previous reports suggest he hadn't done in years." These aren't the actions of children being harmed by inadequate care. Dorothy's financial records, presented with the transparency of someone who had nothing to hide, revealed the truth of her sacrifices. Harold's watch, her wedding ring, winter coats, and Sunday shoes had all been sold to purchase necessities for the boys. Her pension covered basic expenses, and the community had begun contributing food, clothing, and small amounts of money as neighbors witnessed the transformation occurring within the Whitman household. "I may not have much money," Dorothy continued, "but I have something these boys need more than material wealth. I have time, attention, and love that asks nothing in return except the chance to help them become the men God intended them to be." The boys themselves were not permitted to testify formally, but their presence in the courtroom spoke volumes to those willing to observe carefully. Sam sat protectively close to his younger companions, his posture alert but no longer defensive. Tommy held a small sketch pad, unconsciously drawing scenes of family life while the adults debated his future. Billy Joe remained close to Dorothy, occasionally reaching out to touch her hand when testimony became particularly harsh. During a brief recess, an unexpected development changed the hearing's trajectory. Miss Patterson, the schoolteacher, arrived with documentation showing that all three boys had been attending classes irregularly throughout the winter. Despite lacking official enrollment, she had been tutoring them privately and could attest to their academic progress and social development. Sam reads at a high school level, Miss Patterson testified when court reconvened. Tommy's artistic ability is remarkable, and his written expression has improved dramatically since October. Billy Joe knows his numbers and letters better than most children his age. These boys are thriving intellectually and emotionally under Mrs. Whitman's care. More surprising testimony came from Sheriff Morgan, who had initially expressed reservations about Dorothy's situation. His investigation into the boys' previous placements had revealed troubling patterns of neglect and abuse that explained their behavioral problems. The family that had reported Sam's violent incident had failed to mention that he was defending Tommy from adult aggression. The theft accusations against Tommy involved taking food from a kitchen where the children were deliberately underfed as punishment. These boys weren't behavioral problems, Sheriff Morgan testified reluctantly. They were children trying to survive in situations that would challenge grown men. Mrs. Whitman has given them the first real home they've known, and the results speak for themselves. The hearing's most dramatic moment came when Billy Joe suddenly stood up in the gallery and walked toward the judge's bench with the fearless determination that only children possess when defending those they love. Bailiffs moved to intercept him, but Judge Harrison raised his hand, curious to hear what the 6-year-old considered important enough to risk contempt of court. "Your Honor," Billy Joe said, his clear voice carrying throughout the courtroom, "Mrs. Dorothy is my mama now. She reads to me when I have bad dreams, and she makes sure I say my prayers every night. She doesn't yell or hit us like the other people did. She just loves us, and we love her back. Isn't that what families are supposed to do?" The simple eloquence of a child's perspective cut through legal complexities like sunlight through morning fog. Judge Harrison studied Billy Joe's earnest face, then looked at Sam and Tommy, who had risen to stand beside their youngest companion in a display of solidarity that spoke louder than any attorney's argument. But legal proceedings follow predetermined paths that emotion cannot easily alter. Attorney General Morrison presented his closing argument with mechanical precision, citing statutes and precedents that prioritized institutional oversight over individual attachment. His position was legally sound, bureaucratically defensible, and morally bankrupt in ways that legal training had taught him to ignore. Dorothy's attorney, a young public defender named Robert Hayes, who had taken the case more from idealism than expectation of success, made his final appeal to the court's sense of justice rather than its adherence to regulation. He argued that removing the boys from Dorothy's care would constitute greater harm than any technical violations of placement procedures. "Your Honor," Hayes concluded, "this court has the opportunity to recognize that families are created by love and choice, not just biology and paperwork. These children have found their home. The question before us is whether we have the wisdom to let them keep it." Judge Harrison called for a 30-minute recess to consider his decision, during which the courtroom buzzed with nervous speculation. Dorothy sat quietly with the boys, holding Billy Joe on her lap while Sam and Tommy flanked her like sentries guarding something precious beyond measure. When court reconvened, Judge Harrison's expression revealed nothing of his internal deliberations. He looked at Dorothy and the boys for a long moment before beginning to speak, his words carrying the weight of a decision that would reshape 4 lives irrevocably. "This case presents a conflict between legal procedure and human need," Judge Harrison began, his voice measured and grave. "The state's arguments regarding proper placement procedures have merit, Mrs. Whitman's acquisition of these children violated several regulations designed to protect children's welfare. Dorothy's heart sank as the judge continued outlining the legal problems with their situation. But Judge Harrison was building toward a conclusion that surprised everyone in the courtroom, including himself. However, he continued, the evidence presented demonstrates that these children are thriving under Mrs. Whitman's care in ways they had not achieved in previous placements. The court finds that the best interests of these children are served by remaining with Mrs. Whitman, subject to regular supervision and completion of proper adoption procedures within 60 days. The courtroom erupted in a mixture of celebration and outrage as Dorothy felt years of tension release from her shoulders like steam from a kettle. The boys surrounded her in a group embrace that spoke of relief so profound it bordered on disbelief. They had won their right to remain together, but victory came with conditions that would test their resolve in the weeks ahead. The victory at the courthouse proved as fragile as morning frost under the harsh scrutiny of bureaucratic machinery designed to find flaws in imperfect situations. Within hours of Judge Harrison's decision, Dorothy received notification that the 60-day window for completing adoption procedures would require documentation that might prove impossible to obtain. Birth certificates for all 3 boys remained missing from state records. Vaccination histories were incomplete, and previous placement records contained discrepancies that raised questions about the children's true identities. More troubling was the appointment of Mrs. Gladys Pemberton as the state-assigned social worker responsible for monitoring Dorothy's household during the probationary period. Mrs. Pemberton arrived on February 16th with the stern efficiency of someone who had built her career on finding reasons why good intentions weren't good enough. Her gray hair was pulled back in a bun so tight it seemed to stretch her facial features into a permanent expression of disapproval, and her steel-rimmed glasses reflected light in ways that made genuine eye contact impossible. "Mrs. Whitman," Mrs. Pemberton announced during her first visit, consulting a clipboard thick with forms and regulations, "I want to be clear about the standards you must meet to retain custody of these children. Any deviation from state guidelines will result in immediate removal and placement in more suitable facilities." Dorothy nodded, though the word "suitable" carried implications that made her stomach tighten with familiar anxiety. She had witnessed enough of the state's definition of suitability to understand that institutional efficiency often took precedence over individual compassion. Mrs. Pemberton's inspection revealed deficiencies that Dorothy had never considered problematic. The boys' shared sleeping arrangements in the living room violated regulations requiring separate beds and adequate privacy. The farmhouse's single bathroom failed to meet standards for a household containing an elderly woman and 3 male children. Most seriously, Dorothy's financial resources were deemed insufficient to provide adequate nutrition, clothing, and medical care without community assistance that the state considered unreliable. These children require structure and supervision that extends beyond maternal affection, Mrs. Pemberton explained, making notes that would become part of an official record. Boys their age need male role models, educational opportunities that prepare them for productive citizenship, and exposure to social situations that will teach them to function in normal society. The criticism stung because it contained elements of truth that Dorothy couldn't entirely dismiss. She was 65 years old, living on a pension that barely covered basic expenses, attempting to raise 3 boys whose developmental needs exceeded her experience and resources. Her love for them was genuine and fierce, but love alone might not be sufficient to overcome the practical challenges they would face in the years ahead. Sam's reaction to Mrs. Pemberton's visit confirmed Dorothy's worst fears about the psychological impact of official scrutiny. The protective shell he had gradually allowed to soften during months of safety hardened again overnight, transforming him back into the wary, defensive child who had first arrived with burlap sacks covering his face. He began hoarding food again, hiding small items in his clothing and watching the windows with the constant vigilance of someone expecting betrayal. "She's going to take us away," Sam told Dorothy one evening after Mrs. Pemberton's third visit had lasted nearly 4 hours. "I can see it in her eyes." "She's just looking for excuses." Tommy's response was more subtle but equally devastating. His artwork changed from scenes of family happiness to darker images of separation and loss. He drew pictures of children walking away from houses, of empty chairs around dinner tables, of birds with broken wings that couldn't fly home. When Dorothy asked about the shift in his artistic themes, Tommy simply shrugged and said, "I draw what I see coming." Billy Joe, perhaps too young to fully understand the implications of official intervention, nevertheless sensed the change in household atmosphere with the intuitive accuracy that had characterized his behavior since arriving. He began following Dorothy everywhere, clinging to her skirts with the desperation of someone who had learned that people disappeared without warning. His nightmares returned with increased frequency, and he often woke crying for the soldier who had promised that Mrs. Dorothy would keep him safe. The financial pressure intensified as Dorothy struggled to address Mrs. Pemberton's recommendations while maintaining basic household expenses. The state required separate beds for the boys, which meant purchasing furniture that cost more than Dorothy's monthly pension. Adequate winter clothing for 3 growing children exceeded her budget, even after selling her few remaining possessions of value. Most expensive was the requirement for regular medical examinations that would document the boys' health and development for state records. Dr. Matthews, Millfield's only physician, provided medical care with the gruff kindness of someone who had treated 3 generations of the same families and understood that human need didn't always align with ability to pay. His examination of the boys revealed the physical evidence of their previous experiences: Sam's poorly healed broken ribs, Tommy's lingering malnutrition, Billy Joe's scarred back that spoke of punishment too severe for any child to endure. "These boys are healthier now than they've been in years," Dr. Matthews told Dorothy privately after completing his examinations. "Whatever you're doing, it's working. Don't let bureaucrats convince you otherwise." But Dr. Matthews' medical bills, even reduced to accommodate Dorothy's circumstances, represented another expense that pushed her budget beyond sustainability. She began skipping meals to ensure the boys ate properly, wore Harold's old coats layered over thin dresses to avoid purchasing winter clothing for herself, and walked to town instead of using gasoline for the truck that was nearly as old as she was. The breaking point came during Mrs. Pemberton's final visit in early March, when spring was still weeks away and Dorothy's resources had dwindled to less than $5. The social worker arrived unannounced to find Dorothy mending clothes by lamplight while the boys did homework at the kitchen table, their breath visible in the cold air because Dorothy had been rationing heating oil to make it last until her next pension check. "Mrs. Whitman," Mrs. Pemberton said, her voice carrying the satisfaction of someone whose predictions had proven accurate, "I'm afraid this situation has become untenable. These children are suffering from inadequate housing, insufficient heating, and malnutrition that endangers their health and development." Dorothy looked around her kitchen, seeing it suddenly through official eyes that noticed peeling paint instead of hand-drawn pictures on the walls, threadbare furniture instead of the love that had transformed a house into a home, empty cupboards instead of the creative meals that had filled growing boys' stomachs even when resources were scarce. "The boys are healthy and happy," Dorothy protested, though her voice lacked the conviction that had sustained her through previous challenges. "They're doing well in school, they help with chores, they're learning to be responsible young men." "They're learning to accept poverty as normal," Mrs. Pemberton corrected sharply. "They're being raised in conditions that teach them to expect less from life than they deserve." "Is that really the gift you want to give them?" The question hit Dorothy like a physical blow because it forced her to confront the possibility that her love, however genuine, might not be enough to provide what the boys needed to build successful futures. Her devotion to them was unquestionable, but devotion couldn't pay for college education, couldn't provide the social connections that opened doors to opportunity, couldn't overcome the limitations imposed by geography and economic circumstances. Mrs. Pemberton's final report, submitted to the state on March 10th, recommended immediate removal of all 3 children from Dorothy's care. The document detailed every deficiency in clinical language that transformed acts of love into evidence of negligence. Dorothy's sacrifices were characterized as inability to provide adequate care. The boys' contentment was dismissed as adaptation to substandard conditions. The family bonds that had grown stronger through shared struggles were viewed as unhealthy attachment that prevented the children from developing appropriate independence. The removal order arrived on March 12th, scheduled for execution on March 15th, exactly 2 years after the newspaper article about Sam's father's suicide, a coincidence that felt like cosmic cruelty to Dorothy as she read the official notification with hands that trembled like autumn leaves. The boys would be separated to prevent them from reinforcing each other's behavioral problems. Sam would go to a boys' industrial school in Dallas where strict discipline could channel his leadership tendencies toward acceptable purposes. Tommy would be placed with a farm family in East Texas where hard work and limited educational opportunities would prevent him from developing artistic interests that the state considered impractical. Billy Joe, considered most likely to adapt successfully to new circumstances, would be sent to a Catholic orphanage in Houston where structured religious education could address his unusual psychological characteristics. Dorothy read the orders aloud to the boys that evening, her voice breaking as she explained that in 3 days their family would cease to exist. The document's language was clinical and final, offering no appeal process, no opportunity for negotiation, no recognition that love might have value beyond its ability to provide material advantages. The next morning, Dorothy woke to find 3 packed bags by the front door and 3 boys sitting quietly at the kitchen table, waiting for breakfast that none of them wanted to eat. They had made their decision without discussion, choosing dignity over futile resistance, accepting separation as the price for having experienced love, however briefly. In 72 hours, everything Dorothy had built from broken pieces would be dismantled by people who believed that institutional care was superior to imperfect love, that professional training was more valuable than maternal instinct, and that children were better served by regulations than by relationships. The first shock came on the morning of March 13th when Dorothy discovered a leather satchel hidden beneath Harold's old workbench, covered in dust and forgotten for 7 years. Her search for items to sell had become desperate, driven by the wild hope that she might find something valuable enough to hire a lawyer and fight the removal order. Instead, she found something that shattered everything she thought she knew about her marriage, her husband, and the mysterious child who had called her name from beneath a burlap sack. The satchel contained letters Harold had never sent, photographs he had never shown her, and a birth certificate that made Dorothy's hands shake so violently she nearly dropped the fragile paper. William Joseph Miller, born June 15, 1946, father listed as Harold James Whitman, mother listed as Catherine Rose Miller, deceased. Billy Joe's birth certificate bearing Harold's name in faded ink that testified to a truth Dorothy had never suspected. The letters, written in Harold's careful handwriting during his final months in the Pacific, told a story of love, guilt, and impossible choices. Catherine Miller had been a Red Cross nurse stationed at Harold's base in the Philippines, a young woman whose kindness to wounded soldiers had blossomed into something deeper during the dark months before the war's end. Harold's letters revealed a man torn between duty to his wife at home and love for a woman who had given him something Dorothy had never been able to provide, a child. My dearest Dorothy, read one letter dated 3 weeks before Harold's death. I have done something that will break your heart. But I cannot die with this secret burning inside me like shrapnel I can't remove. Catherine died giving birth to our son, and I have arranged for the boy to be cared for until I can return and find a way to explain what cannot be explained. I know I have betrayed everything we promised each other, but I love this child as I have never loved anything in my life. If something happens to me, please find him. Please love him the way I cannot. Dorothy sank onto Harold's old stool, the letters scattered around her like autumn leaves carrying the debris of a marriage she had thought she understood completely. The man she had mourned as a faithful husband had fathered a child with another woman, had loved someone else during their years of separation, had planned a future that included confessions and forgiveness that death had made impossible. But even as betrayal twisted in her chest like a knife blade, Dorothy felt another emotion emerging from the wreckage of her assumptions. Billy Joe's uncanny knowledge of Harold's habits, his ability to hum melodies that Harold had invented in private moments, his dream about the soldier who sang, everything suddenly made terrible, wonderful sense. The child wasn't psychic or mystical. He was Harold's son, carrying genetic memories and inherited traits that connected him to a father he had never consciously known. The second shock arrived that afternoon in the form of Jeremiah Stone, who appeared at Dorothy's door with an expression that mixed shame, determination, and something that might have been paternal affection. Dorothy had assumed his frequent visits were motivated by official business or idle curiosity, never suspecting that his interest in her situation stemmed from personal investment in its outcome. "Dorothy," Stone said, removing his hat with uncharacteristic nervousness, "I need to tell you something that should have been said 40 years ago. I need to tell you who I really am." The confession that followed unraveled another layer of Dorothy's understanding about the forces that had shaped her life. Jeremiah Stone was not simply the local auctioneer who had sold 3 boys for $18. He was Dorothy's father, the man who had abandoned his pregnant wife and infant daughter in 1913 to seek his fortune in the Oklahoma oil fields and had never found the courage to return home. "Your mother told everyone I died in a drilling accident," Stone explained, his weathered hands turning his hat brim in nervous circles. "It was easier than admitting I was a coward who ran away when responsibility got too heavy to carry. I've spent 40 years trying to find the courage to face what I left behind." Stone's revelation explained his presence at the auction where Dorothy first encountered the boys. He had orchestrated their availability using his connections in the informal network that moved unwanted children between counties and states, specifically to test whether his daughter had inherited his capacity for love or his tendency toward abandonment. Watching Dorothy purchase 3 strangers' children with her last $18 had answered a question that had haunted him for decades. "I wanted to see if you were still the little girl who brought home every stray cat and broken-winged bird she found," Stone continued, tears cutting tracks through the dust on his cheeks. "I wanted to know if running away was a family trait or if you had your mother's heart." The father, who had been absent for Dorothy's entire adult life, had been watching from the shadows, manipulating circumstances to create an opportunity for redemption that he lacked the courage to pursue directly. His influence extended beyond the auction. He had been quietly supporting Dorothy's legal battle, providing information to her attorney, and using his knowledge of the child welfare system to navigate bureaucratic obstacles. But Stone's most shocking revelation concerned the network of child trafficking that had ensnared Sam, Tommy, and Billy Joe. His position as auctioneer provided cover for activities that went far beyond legitimate livestock sales, connecting him to a regional system that moved children like inventory between buyers who viewed them as sources of unpaid labor rather than human beings deserving protection. "Reverend Blackwell's been running children through here for 5 years, Stone confessed, his voice heavy with the weight of complicity he could no longer bear. Uses his church connections to identify families in crisis, then arranges for children to be removed and sold to buyers who pay premium prices for workers who can't complain to authorities. The revelation transformed Dorothy's understanding of the opposition she had faced from Millfield's religious community. Reverend Blackwell's testimony against her had not stemmed from genuine concern about child welfare, but from fear that her successful adoption would expose his profitable arrangement with buyers who preferred their human acquisitions to come without legal complications. Stone's evidence included financial records showing payments from buyers across 3 states, correspondence detailing the selection and delivery of specific children, and photographs documenting conditions that violated every standard of human decency. The scope of the operation extended far beyond Millfield, connecting rural communities across Texas, Oklahoma, and Arkansas in a network that treated children as renewable resources to be harvested and distributed according to market demand. The third and most devastating revelation emerged from Stone's investigation into Billy Joe's background. The boy had not simply been abandoned or orphaned. He had been deliberately concealed from Dorothy's knowledge by military officials who had promised Harold they would ensure his son's welfare after his death. Instead, they had sold the child to the same network that had claimed Sam and Tommy, erasing his identity and severing his connection to the father who had died believing his son would be protected. Harold left instructions and money for the boy's care, Stone explained, producing documents that bore official military seals and Harold's familiar signature. He established a trust fund, arranged for guardianship, even wrote letters for you to receive when Billy Joe was old enough to understand who his father had been. But the officers handling his estate had debts that Harold's money could cover, and a child with no legal standing seemed like acceptable collateral. The theft of Billy Joe's inheritance had funded the very system that had brutalized him, creating a circle of exploitation that used Harold's love for his son to finance the child's abuse. The irony was so cruel it seemed designed by a malevolent universe that delighted in transforming good intentions into sources of suffering. But Stone's revelations also provided Dorothy with weapons she hadn't known existed. The documentation he had gathered over months of careful investigation proved that Billy Joe was legally her stepson, entitled to Harold's veteran benefits and protected by federal laws governing military dependents. Sam and Tommy's placement in the trafficking network had violated interstate commerce regulations, making their situation a federal rather than state matter. "I can stop the removal order," Stone told Dorothy, his voice carrying the conviction of someone who had finally found the courage to choose love over fear. "I can expose Blackwell's operation, shut down the network, and ensure these boys stay with the woman who should have been their mother from the beginning." The price of Stone's intervention would be his own arrest and prosecution, the destruction of the reputation he had spent decades building, and the exposure of 40 years of cowardice that had shaped every relationship in his life. But watching Dorothy's love transform 3 broken children had taught him that some prices were worth paying, even when payment came too late for redemption. "Why now?" Dorothy asked, studying the face that carried echoes of her own features, seeing the father she had grieved as a child standing before her as a stranger offering salvation. "Why are you willing to sacrifice everything for children you barely know?" Stone looked toward the kitchen window where the boys sat doing homework in the golden light of late afternoon, their voices creating the kind of domestic harmony that had been absent from Dorothy's life for too many years to count. "Because they're not just any children," he replied quietly. "They're your children, which makes them my grandchildren, and I've already lost too many years to cowardice. I won't lose any more." The revelations that had shattered Dorothy's understanding of her past also illuminated a path toward a future she had thought impossible. Harold's betrayal had been motivated by love rather than selfishness. Her father's abandonment had been followed by decades of hidden protection, and the boys who had arrived in her life carrying their own mysteries were bound to her by connections deeper than choice or circumstance. As evening shadows lengthened across the farmhouse that had witnessed so much sorrow and joy, Dorothy understood that the removal order scheduled for the following morning would never be executed. The truth had emerged with the force of a dam breaking, carrying away the lies and deceptions that had threatened to destroy the family she had built from broken pieces. But truth, like love, carried its own complications and demands. The fight for her boys was not ending. It was transforming into something larger and more dangerous than a simple custody battle. Dorothy was about to become the catalyst for exposing a network of corruption that reached far beyond Millfield's borders, and the enemies she had thought were local bureaucrats were actually part of a system that viewed her victory as a threat to their continued prosperity. The war for her family was about to begin in earnest, and Dorothy would need every weapon Stone's revelations had provided to ensure that love triumphed over the forces that treated children as commodities to be bought and sold without regard for their humanity. The dawn of March 15th broke over Millfield with the kind of golden light that photographers spend lifetimes trying to capture, as if the universe itself wanted to illuminate the miracle unfolding in Dorothy Whitman's farmhouse kitchen. Instead of state officials arriving to separate her family, Dorothy found herself surrounded by federal agents, county investigators, and a team of lawyers whose presence transformed her modest home into the command center for the largest child trafficking investigation in Texas history. Agent Thomas Richardson of the Federal Bureau of Investigation had driven through the night from Dallas after receiving Stone's evidence, his weathered face carrying the grim determination of someone who had seen too many cases where justice arrived too late to matter. The documentation Stone provided revealed a network spanning 5 states, involving dozens of officials, and generating profits that exceeded many legitimate businesses operating in the post-war economy. "Mrs. Whitman," Agent Richardson said as he spread photographs and financial records across Dorothy's kitchen table, "what you've uncovered here represents one of the most sophisticated child trafficking operations we've encountered. Your boys weren't just victims, they were merchandise in a system that's been operating under our noses for years." The investigation moved with the swift efficiency of federal authority unleashed against targets who had grown careless through years of operating without oversight. Reverend Blackwell was arrested at his church during morning prayers, his congregation watching in stunned silence as agents led their spiritual leader away in handcuffs that seemed to diminish his moral authority with each metallic click. Mrs. Pemberton was taken into custody at the county courthouse, her clipboards and regulations proving useless against charges of conspiracy and fraud that carried sentences measured in decades rather than bureaucratic reprimands. But the most dramatic arrest occurred when Sheriff Morgan, accompanied by federal agents, appeared at Judge Harrison's chambers with a warrant that detailed the judge's financial relationship with buyers who had purchased children through Blackwell's network. Harrison's legal expertise evaporated as he faced evidence of bank deposits that coincided suspiciously with his custody decisions, transforming him from judicial authority into another defendant in a case that was reshaping the legal landscape of East Texas. Sam, Tommy, and Billy Joe watched the morning's events unfold with the wide-eyed fascination of children witnessing history being written in their living room. The boys who had arrived as nameless property were now at the center of a federal investigation that would protect thousands of other children from the fate they had narrowly escaped. Their testimonies, carefully recorded by agents trained in interviewing traumatized children, provided crucial evidence about the network's operations and the conditions they had endured in previous placements. "You boys are heroes," Agent Richardson told them during a break in the proceedings. "Your courage in trusting Mrs. Dorothy has exposed crimes that might have continued for years without detection. Billy Joe, whose mysterious knowledge had initially puzzled Dorothy, proved to be a key witness whose memories of conversations between traffickers provided investigators with names, locations, and operational details that corroborated Stone's documentary evidence. The child's unusual ability to recall specific details wasn't supernatural, but rather the survival skill of someone who had learned that remembering adult conversations could mean the difference between safety and danger. The legal proceedings that followed moved with unprecedented speed as federal prosecutors built cases against defendants whose guilt was documented in their own records. Stone's cooperation with investigators, combined with his intimate knowledge of the network's operations, provided authorities with evidence so comprehensive that most defendants accepted plea bargains rather than face trials where conviction was virtually guaranteed. Dorothy's legal status regarding the boys was resolved through emergency proceedings that recognized Billy Joe as Harold's legitimate heir, entitled to veteran benefits and protected by federal laws governing military dependents. Sam and Tommy's adoption was expedited through federal court, bypassing state regulations that had been corrupted by the same officials now facing prosecution for their crimes. The financial settlement that followed exceeded Dorothy's wildest dreams of security and comfort. Harold's trust fund for Billy Joe, stolen by corrupt officials and invested in the trafficking network, had grown substantially over the years. The federal government's restitution payments to trafficking victims provided additional resources, while Stone's decision to deed his property to Dorothy ensured that the boys would never again face the specter of poverty-driven separation. But the most profound transformation occurred within the walls of the farmhouse that had become synonymous with love's triumph over institutional indifference. The boys who had arrived as strangers bound by shared trauma evolved into brothers whose bonds transcended blood relationships. Sam's protective instincts matured into genuine leadership as he helped coordinate the investigation's impact on other trafficking victims. Tommy's artistic talents found new expression in drawings that celebrated family rather than documenting loss. Billy Joe's mysterious connection to Harold resolved into the natural inheritance of a son who carried his father's musical gifts and moral compass. Dorothy herself was transformed from an isolated widow into a woman whose courage had catalyzed changes extending far beyond her personal circumstances. Reporters arrived from newspapers across the region, drawn by a story that combined human interest with social justice in ways that captured readers' imagination and indignation. Dorothy's photograph appeared in the Dallas Morning News, above a caption that read, "Texas Widow's Love Exposes Child Trafficking Network," but she remained focused on the daily reality of raising 3 boys rather than the historical significance of her actions. The Easter Sunday celebration that year carried special meaning for a family that had narrowly escaped permanent separation. Dorothy's farmhouse overflowed with guests who came to witness the miracle of love's victory over systematic evil. Dr. Matthews brought his family. Miss Patterson arrived with artwork created by her students to honor their classmates' courage, and dozens of neighbors who had initially questioned Dorothy's judgment now offered support and friendship. Agent Richardson returned for the celebration, accompanied by other federal investigators who had become personally invested in the case's outcome. They brought news that the network's exposure had led to similar investigations in neighboring states, potentially freeing hundreds of children from situations similar to what Sam, Tommy, and Billy Joe had endured. "This case has changed how we approach child welfare investigations," Agent Richardson told Dorothy as they watched the boys playing with neighborhood children in the yard where Billy Joe had first demonstrated his mysterious knowledge. "Your decision to fight for these boys has protected children you'll never meet in places you'll never visit." The afternoon's festivities included the dedication of a small monument that Stone had commissioned for the front yard, bearing the inscription, "Love multiplies when divided," and the names of the 4 family members who had proved that biology was less important than choice in creating lasting bonds. Billy Joe sang Danny Boy for the assembled guests, his voice carrying Harold's melody into a future that promised hope rather than loss. As evening approached and guests departed, Dorothy found herself alone with the boys who had transformed her empty house into a home filled with purpose and joy. They sat on the front porch watching the sunset paint the Texas sky in shades of gold and crimson, each lost in private thoughts about the journey that had brought them together and the future they would build as a family. "Thank you," Sam said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of gratitude too deep for elaborate expression. "For what?" Dorothy asked, though she understood the magnitude of what had been saved. "For seeing us," Tommy replied, speaking for all 3 boys with the eloquence that had emerged from months of security and love. Billy Joe climbed into Dorothy's lap, humming softly as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Somewhere in that melody, Dorothy heard echoes of Harold's voice, finally at peace with the knowledge that his son had found the love and protection he had died hoping to provide. The farmhouse that had once echoed with loneliness now resonated with the laughter and conversations of a family bound by choice rather than chance, proving that love, when given freely and unconditionally, possessed the power to heal wounds that seemed beyond remedy and create bonds stronger than any force arrayed against them. Sometimes the greatest gifts come wrapped in the most unexpected packages. When 65-year-old Dorothy Whitman saw 3 children with sacks over their heads being sold at a livestock auction for $3 each, she never imagined that her $18 purchase would transform not just their lives, but expose a network of corruption and create a family bound by love rather than blood. Like many of us who have experienced loss, whether it's the death of a spouse, children moving away, or dreams that seem to slip through our fingers, Dorothy had learned to live with the ache of empty rooms and silent dinners. But when 6-year-old Billy Joe mysteriously called her name from beneath that burlap sack, she discovered that it's never too late for love to find us again. Her courage to open her heart to 3 broken children didn't just save them from a trafficking network, it reminded an entire community that family isn't about biology. It's about choice, commitment, and the willingness to believe that love multiplies when divided. Dorothy's story proves that our greatest chapters might still be unwritten, waiting for us to have the courage to turn the page. Questions for you. Have you ever felt called to help someone when logic said you couldn't afford to? What unexpected packages has life brought to your doorstep that turned out to be blessings in disguise? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.